The world often remembers great minds only after their work changes history. But every legend begins quietly, somewhere ordinary, long before anyone realizes what is coming. Imagine a small town in Italy more than 500 years ago. Narrow streets, stone houses warmed by the sun, the smell of wood smoke drifting through the air as evening settles over the hills of Tuscany. In this quiet place, a child is born who will one day change the way humanity understands art, science, and imagination. His name is Leonardo. Today we know him as Leonardo da Vinci, painter of the Mona Lisa, designer of strange flying machines, observer of nature, student of anatomy, and one of the most curious minds the world has ever known. But none of that existed yet. At the beginning, him to look deeper into everything around him. Clouds drifting across the sky, water flowing in a stream, birds gliding through the air. Many people saw ordinary things. Leonardo saw mysteries waiting to be understood. So tonight, as you relax and slowly drift into sleep, we are going to travel back in time, back to Renaissance Italy, back to a world of artists, inventors, and dreamers. We will follow the life of a boy who grew into one of the greatest minds in human history. But to understand Leonardo, we must first understand the world that shaped him. The year is 1452. Italy is not yet the unified country we know today. Instead, it is a collection of powerful city-states, Florence, Milan, Venice, Rome, each with its own rulers, rivalries, and ambitions. Florence is one of the most remarkable places in Europe at this time. It is a city alive with new ideas. Artists experiment with perspective and realism. Architects design bold buildings that seem to defy gravity. Scholars rediscover ancient Greek and Roman knowledge that had been forgotten for centuries. This period will later be called the Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and learning. But in 1452, no one knows that yet. For the people living there, life is still simple in many ways. Farmers work the land, merchants travel between cities, craftsmen shape wood, stone, and metal with patient hands. And in a small countryside village called Vinci, nestled among olive trees and rolling hills, Leonardo enters the world. His birth is unusual for the time. Leonardo is the son of a respected notary named Ser Piero and a young woman named Caterina. But his parents are not married. In many societies, this would bring shame. But in the countryside of Tuscany, life is more practical than formal. Leonardo grows up surrounded by extended family, moving between homes and relatives. He spends much of his childhood outdoors, wandering through fields and forests. These early years shape the way he sees the world. While other children play games or run through the village streets, Leonardo often pauses to observe things others barely notice. The pattern of leaves on a tree, the way water curves around a stone in a stream, the movement of birds riding invisible currents of air. Even as a child, he studies the natural world with intense attention. He sketches animals in the dirt with sticks. He asks endless questions about how things work. Why do clouds move the way they do? How do fish swim so smoothly through water? Why can birds fly while humans cannot? For most adults, these questions seem unimportant. But for Leonardo, they are the beginning of a lifelong journey. His mind is restless, constantly exploring. Curiosity becomes his greatest teacher. The countryside of Vinci is the perfect classroom. Hills, rivers, plants, insects, and animals surround him everywhere he goes. He learns directly from nature itself. And without realizing it, the boy who wanders through fields and watches birds in the sky is slowly developing the habits that will one day make him extraordinary: observation, patience, and an endless desire to understand. These simple traits will eventually lead him to study everything: painting, engineering, anatomy, architecture, mathematics, and even the possibility of human flight. But at this moment in his childhood, none of that is clear yet. Leonardo is simply a curious boy walking through the Tuscan countryside, carrying questions that the world has not yet answered. And very soon, those questions will take him far beyond the quiet village where his story begins. The hills around Vinci were calm and quiet, but beyond them the world was changing quickly. From the hilltops, the countryside of Tuscany looked peaceful and timeless. Olive groves stretched across the slopes. Vineyards followed the gentle curves of the land. Small farmhouses stood between fields where farmers worked slowly beneath the warm sun. Life in the village followed the rhythm of the seasons. In spring, the hills turned bright green. In summer, the fields filled with golden wheat. Autumn brought the harvest of grapes and olives. Winter covered the land in cool mist that rolled through the valleys each morning. For the people of Vinci, this quiet world seemed steady and unchanging. But beyond those calm hills, something remarkable was happening. Only a few hours away stood the city of Florence, one of the most extraordinary places in Europe during the 15th century. Florence was alive with energy. Its streets were crowded with merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and travelers arriving from distant lands. Markets filled the air with the sounds of bargaining and conversation. The smell of bread, leather, and fresh paint drifted through narrow streets lined with tall stone buildings. This was a city where wealth, art, and new ideas mixed together in ways that had rarely happened before. Florence had grown rich through trade and banking. Powerful families controlled great fortunes, and among them, the Medici family had become especially influential. Their wealth allowed them to support artists, architects, and scholars who were transforming the culture of the city. Merchants grew rich from trade across Europe and the Mediterranean. Bankers in Florence lent money to kings and popes, helping finance wars, construction, and governments. But money alone did not define Florence. The city had become a place where learning and creativity flourished. Scholars studied ancient books from Greece and Rome that had been forgotten for centuries. These texts contained ideas about philosophy, science, architecture, and mathematics. For many thinkers of the time, rediscovering this knowledge felt like opening a window into a forgotten world of wisdom. Artists were also beginning to see the world in a completely new way. For centuries, medieval paintings had followed strict traditions. Figures appeared flat and symbolic, often floating against golden backgrounds. But Renaissance artists wanted something different. They wanted their paintings to look real. They wanted people to feel depth, movement, and emotion. Painters began experimenting with perspective, a mathematical technique that created the illusion of space and distance on a flat surface. Suddenly, buildings seemed to stretch into the distance. Streets appeared to recede toward a vanishing point. Human figures stood firmly within believable environments. Sculptors carved stone figures with such skill that the muscles beneath the marble seemed almost alive. Architects studied ancient Roman buildings and designed structures with perfect harmony and balance. Florence was becoming a place where creativity seemed to exist everywhere. Workshops filled the city. Inside them, artists worked from early morning until late evening, shaping wood, carving marble, grinding pigments, and sketching new ideas. Meanwhile, Leonardo was growing older in the quiet countryside. As a teenager, he had already begun to show unusual talent. He drew constantly. Anything he saw could become a sketch. Faces of people in the village, animals moving through the fields, plants growing beside streams, even the strange shapes of clouds drifting across the sky. Sometimes he would sit quietly for long periods, studying how light moved across an object or how shadows slowly changed during the day. He noticed details that others overlooked: how sunlight reflected from water, how leaves overlapped in complex patterns, how the feathers of birds formed delicate structures. His family began to notice that he had a natural ability with drawing. Lines flowed easily from his hand. Even simple sketches seemed full of life and movement. Leonardo's father, Ser Piero, began to realize that his son might have a future as an artist. Ser Piero worked as a notary, a respected profession that involved writing legal documents and contracts for wealthy clients. His work often took him to Florence, where many of his clients lived and conducted business. Through these connections, he knew many influential people in the city. One of them was a famous master artist named Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio was not just a painter. He was a sculptor, engineer, goldsmith, metalworker, and teacher. His workshop was one of the most respected training places for young artists in Florence. Many apprentices worked there, learning not only how to paint, but also how to understand materials, design, mechanics, and geometry. In Renaissance workshops, art was closely connected with science and craftsmanship. Students learned how to mix pigments from crushed minerals and plants. They studied perspective using mathematics. They practiced drawing the human body with careful attention to anatomy. Ser Piero believed this could be the perfect place for his son. So one day he gathered several of Leonardo's drawings and carried them with him to Florence. The workshop of Verrocchio was a busy place filled with activity. Large wooden tables were covered with tools, sketches, and pieces of unfinished sculpture. Apprentices prepared wooden panels for painting. Others ground colorful minerals into fine powders to create pigments used for paints. Some worked on sculptures made of clay, marble, or bronze. The smell of oil, wood, and metal filled the air. The sound of tools tapping against stone echoed through the room. Artists moved carefully around one another as they worked, each focused on their own task. When Ser Piero showed the drawings to Verrocchio, the master studied them carefully. He looked closely at the lines, the proportions, the attention to detail. The sketches were unusual. The lines were confident. The forms were carefully observed. The details were surprisingly precise for someone so young. But what impressed Verrocchio most was something harder to describe. There was sensitivity in the drawings, a sense that the young artist had truly observed the world rather than simply copying it. According to later stories, Verrocchio was immediately impressed. He agreed to accept Leonardo as an apprentice. For Leonardo, this moment changed everything. Around the age of 14, he left the peaceful hills of Vinci and moved to Florence, one of the most exciting creative centers in the world. The city must have felt overwhelming at first. Florence was busy, loud, and full of energy. Market stalls lined the streets. Merchants called out to customers. Bells rang from tall church towers, marking the passing hours of the day. Artists and craftsmen worked everywhere. The massive cathedral dome, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, dominated the skyline like a symbol of human ambition. Its enormous red roof rose above the city, visible from miles away. For a young boy from the countryside, it must have seemed like stepping into another world. But inside Verrocchio's workshop, Leonardo quickly found his place. Life as an apprentice was demanding. Students did not begin by painting masterpieces. First, they learned the basic skills that supported all artistic work. They cleaned brushes and tools. They prepared wooden panels with layers of plaster. They mixed paints using minerals, plants, and oils. Grinding pigments into powder could take hours of careful work. Apprentices also studied geometry, perspective, and anatomy. They practiced drawing hands, faces, and drapery over and over again. They copied the works of older masters. They studied how light created shadows. They learned patience. This training built the foundation for everything that followed. Leonardo absorbed knowledge with incredible speed. He watched the older artists closely. He studied their techniques. He experimented constantly with his own drawings. Soon his teachers began to notice that the young apprentice had abilities far beyond ordinary students. Leonardo had something rare. Not only could he draw beautifully, but he also wanted to understand the deeper structure of everything he saw. When he painted a hand, he wondered about the bones and muscles beneath the skin. When he sketched a bird, he studied how the wings moved through the air. When he drew water, he watched how currents twisted and flowed around obstacles. For Leonardo, art was not only about beauty, it was about understanding the hidden rules of nature. And that way of thinking would eventually lead him far beyond the limits of traditional painting. But first, he had many years of learning ahead of him. The workshop of Verrocchio would become the place where Leonardo transformed from a curious village boy into a young artist ready to explore the mysteries of the world. And very soon he would create something so extraordinary that even his own master would be astonished. Inside Verrocchio's workshop, days began early. Long before the first sunlight reached the rooftops of Florence, the workshop was already awake. Apprentices arrived quietly through the narrow streets while the city was still half asleep. The morning air carried the cool scent of stone and river water drifting from the Arno. Inside the workshop, lamps and candles glowed softly against the walls. The apprentices began their work almost immediately. Wooden panels were sanded smooth and prepared for painting. Bowls of pigments were mixed carefully with oils and egg yolk to create bright colors that would later cover the surfaces of paintings. Sheets of paper filled with practice drawings lay scattered across long wooden tables. Some students ground colored minerals into fine powder using heavy stone tools. Others stretched canvases or prepared blocks of marble for sculpture. The workshop was alive with quiet concentration. The sound of scraping tools, grinding stones, and soft conversation filled the room. The work was constant, but for Leonardo, it never felt like a burden. Every task was another opportunity to learn something new. While other apprentices completed their duties quickly, Leonardo often slowed down to study what he was doing. When preparing paint, he noticed how different minerals produced different colors and textures. When sanding wood, he examined how light reflected across smooth surfaces. When watching other artists draw, he carefully observed how lines formed shapes and movement. To Leonardo, the workshop was not only a place of work, it was a place of discovery. He studied how light touched different surfaces. He noticed how fabric folded naturally over the body. He watched how the human face changed when a person smiled, frowned, or grew thoughtful. Even small details fascinated him. How shadows softened as they moved across curved objects. How reflections appeared on metal tools. How the color of distant mountains seemed to fade into blue. Many apprentices simply followed instructions. They learned techniques by copying their teachers. Leonardo asked questions. Why does shadow look softer on some surfaces than others? Why do distant mountains appear blue? Why does water reflect the sky? Why do some colors appear brighter in sunlight, but darker in shade? These questions sometimes puzzled the other students, but they revealed something important about Leonardo's mind. He did not only want to copy the world, he wanted to understand it. Verrocchio noticed this unusual curiosity. The master artist had trained many talented students before. Some were skilled painters, others became respected sculptors or craftsmen. But Leonardo's ability to observe tiny details was exceptional. His drawings felt alive in a way that few artists could achieve. When he sketched animals, they seemed ready to move. When he drew people, their expressions appeared thoughtful and natural. There was a sense of life within his lines. Soon, Leonardo began assisting with real projects. In Renaissance workshops, large paintings were rarely created by one artist alone. Instead, they were often produced by teams working together under the direction of a master. The master designed the composition and painted the most important figures. Apprentices helped paint backgrounds, landscapes, clothing, or smaller characters within the scene. Through this process, young artists slowly developed their skills. One of the most famous moments from Leonardo's early career came during the creation of a painting known as the Baptism of Christ. The painting showed a biblical scene where John the Baptist pours water over the head of Jesus, while angels stand nearby. Verrocchio painted most of the scene himself, but he allowed his young apprentice Leonardo to paint one of the angels standing beside Christ. For Leonardo, this was an important responsibility. He approached the task with intense care. He spent time studying how light touched human skin. He carefully painted delicate curls of hair that seemed almost soft enough to touch. The angel's expression was calm and thoughtful, unlike the stiff figures common in many paintings of that time. Leonardo worked slowly and patiently. Instead of sharp outlines, he blended colors gently so that forms seemed to emerge gradually from light and shadow. When the work was finished, something remarkable happened. Leonardo's angel looked more alive than the rest of the painting. The softness of the face, the natural posture, the subtle shading of light and shadow. All of it felt different from the traditional style used by many artists. According to later stories, Verrocchio himself was so amazed that he supposedly decided never to paint again, realizing that his student had surpassed him. The story may be exaggerated, but it reflects something important. Leonardo was developing a new way of seeing. Instead of painting rigid forms with clear outlines, he allowed shapes to dissolve gently into surrounding light. Forms appeared softer, more natural, almost like objects slowly emerging from mist. This technique would later become known as sfumato, a soft blending that made images look more realistic and mysterious. But even while his artistic reputation began to grow, Leonardo's interests were expanding in many directions. He filled notebooks with sketches and ideas. These notebooks became companions that followed him everywhere. Strange machines appeared in his drawings, gears, wheels, and mechanical devices that looked far ahead of their time. He sketched flying machines inspired by the wings of birds. He studied plants and drew their leaves with scientific precision. He observed human faces and recorded tiny expressions that revealed hidden emotions. For Leonardo, the world was a giant puzzle. Art was only one part of that puzzle. During quiet evenings after work in the workshop, he often sat alone drawing by candlelight. The rest of the apprentices might rest or talk quietly, but Leonardo continued working. Page after page filled with notes and sketches. Some drawings showed muscles beneath the skin. Others showed whirlpools of water or mechanical devices with rotating parts. His notebooks were not organized like normal books. Ideas appeared everywhere, mixed together. A study of a bird's wing might sit next to a design for a bridge. A drawing of a human face might appear beside notes about flowing water. A mechanical gear might appear beside sketches of plants. To Leonardo, everything in nature was connected. The movement of water resembled the movement of hair. The branching of trees resembled the veins inside the human body. The flight of birds hinted at the possibility that humans might someday fly as well. These ideas were radical for the time. Most artists focused only on religious subjects or decorative beauty. Leonardo believed art and science belonged together. To paint the human body well, he believed you must understand anatomy. To paint landscapes accurately, you must understand geology, clouds, and light. To design machines, you must study motion and balance. This approach made him very different from other painters. He was not just an artist. He was becoming a thinker, an observer, and an inventor. Florence in the late 15th century was the perfect place for someone like Leonardo. The city celebrated new ideas. Wealthy families like the Medici supported artists, scientists, architects, and philosophers. Workshops, libraries, and academies filled the city with conversation and debate. But Florence was also competitive. Artists constantly searched for new opportunities and powerful patrons who could fund large projects. Reputation mattered. A single successful commission could change an artist's future. As Leonardo grew older, he began to realize that his ambitions might stretch beyond the limits of a single workshop. The world was larger than Florence. He wanted to build machines. He wanted to design grand architectural projects. He wanted to explore scientific mysteries that most people had never even considered. And soon, an unexpected opportunity would take him far from Florence and place him in the service of one of the most powerful rulers in Italy. This decision would mark the beginning of a completely new chapter in Leonardo's life. A chapter where art, engineering, and imagination would merge in ways the world had never seen before. By the time Leonardo reached his early 30s, Florence had already shaped him into a skilled artist and an unusually curious thinker. Years of training inside Verrocchio's workshop had given him strong foundations. He could paint detailed figures, sculpt in clay, design decorations for festivals, and construct mechanical devices for theatrical performances. He had also learned how to observe the world with unusual attention. Yet despite his growing abilities, Leonardo still struggled to gain the kind of large commissions that brought fame and stability to Renaissance artists. Florence was full of talented painters. Some had already earned the trust of powerful patrons. Others had built strong reputations through years of successful work. Competition between artists was intense, and wealthy families often preferred to hire masters who were already well established. Leonardo received smaller assignments, but the truly grand projects often went to others. For a man whose mind was filled with ambitious ideas, this situation felt limiting. Leonardo began to look elsewhere. Far to the north lay the city of Milan, ruled by a powerful and ambitious leader named Ludovico Sforza, often called Ludovico il Moro. Milan was very different from Florence. Florence was a republic where political power was shared among wealthy families and councils. Milan, by contrast, was a ducal court where authority centered around a single ruler and his advisors. The city itself was large, wealthy, and strategically important. Strong stone walls surrounded Milan. Defensive towers guarded the gates. Soldiers patrolled the streets and city entrances. The duchy often found itself involved in military conflicts with neighboring states. Because of this, engineering and military technology were highly valued. Ludovico Sforza wanted his court to appear strong, cultured, and sophisticated. He welcomed artists, musicians, engineers, and scholars whose talents could enhance his reputation. Leonardo believed Milan might offer the opportunities he needed. But instead of presenting himself only as a painter, Leonardo did something unexpected. He wrote a letter. The letter, addressed to Ludovico Sforza, read almost like a job application. Yet what made it remarkable was the way Leonardo described his abilities. He barely mentioned painting. Instead, he listed a series of engineering skills. Leonardo wrote that he could design strong and lightweight bridges that could be easily transported and quickly assembled during military campaigns. He explained that he could construct machines capable of launching stones and projectiles with great force. He described defensive devices that could protect soldiers during battle. He claimed he could design armored vehicles that could advance safely against enemy forces. He even suggested systems for draining water from deep trenches and constructing tunnels beneath fortifications. The letter continued with descriptions of inventions that could confuse or surprise enemies during war. Only near the end of the message did Leonardo briefly mention that he was also capable of painting and sculpture. This unusual approach reveals something important about Leonardo. He understood that powerful rulers valued practical solutions, especially those connected to military strength. Leonardo knew that presenting himself as an engineer and inventor might capture the Duke's attention far more effectively than simply offering his services as an artist. Whether Ludovico was impressed by the letter or simply curious about the unusual young man behind it, the result was the same. Leonardo was invited to Milan. The journey north brought him into a completely different environment. Florence had been lively, filled with merchants, bankers, and independent artists. Milan felt more structured, more disciplined, and more closely tied to political power. The city was surrounded by massive fortifications. Inside the walls stood wide streets, busy markets, and large administrative buildings that supported the Duke's government. The atmosphere carried a sense of authority. For Leonardo, however, Milan was not simply a political center. It was a place full of possibilities. Ludovico Sforza wanted his court to appear impressive to visitors from across Europe. Grand celebrations, artistic displays, and technological demonstrations all helped strengthen the Duke's reputation. Leonardo quickly became involved in many different activities. He designed elaborate costumes and stage sets for court celebrations. Festivals and theatrical performances were important displays of power and prestige. When foreign ambassadors visited Milan, the Duke wanted them to witness spectacular displays of creativity and wealth. Leonardo's imagination made him perfect for these events. He created mechanical devices that moved scenery across stages. Hidden mechanisms allowed dramatic transformations during performances. Artificial mountains, moving stars, and mythical creatures appeared during elaborate theatrical productions. Decorations transformed ordinary halls into magical environments. Visitors to the court were often amazed by these creative displays. At the same time, Leonardo continued developing engineering ideas. He studied the landscape around Milan and sketched designs for canals and irrigation systems that could improve agriculture and transportation. He examined the structure of buildings and imagined ways to strengthen them against attack. His notebooks filled with diagrams of machines. Some resembled early tanks with protective armor and rotating weapons. Others showed complex systems of gears and pulleys designed to lift heavy objects or move construction materials. Many of these inventions were never built. But the drawings themselves reveal the incredible range of Leonardo's thinking. He was not limited by the technology of his time. Instead, he imagined what might become possible as tools, materials, and knowledge improved. Meanwhile, his artistic skills were gaining recognition. At the court of Milan, Leonardo began working on one of the most ambitious sculptural projects of the Renaissance. Ludovico Sforza wanted a massive bronze statue honoring his father, Francesco Sforza, the founder of the ruling dynasty. The statue was planned to be enormous, a giant horse carrying the armored duke into history. Equestrian statues had existed before, but none on the scale Ludovico envisioned. Leonardo threw himself into the project with enthusiasm. He studied horses carefully, observing them in stables and fields. He drew them standing, walking, and rearing in powerful poses. He analyzed how their muscles moved beneath the skin and how their weight balanced through their legs. Creating such a large bronze statue required not only artistic skill, but also advanced engineering knowledge. Leonardo had to design complex molds that could hold molten metal. He had to calculate how tons of bronze would flow during the casting process. He carefully planned how the internal structure of the statue would support its massive weight. Years of work went into preparing the project. Clay models were created and adjusted repeatedly. Structural supports were tested. Leonardo refined the horse's pose again and again, searching for a perfect balance between strength, movement, and realism. Visitors who saw the massive clay model were amazed. The sculpture towered above them. It was said to be the largest equestrian statue ever attempted. Yet history would intervene before the project could be completed. Political tensions across Italy were rising. Foreign armies were beginning to move across the peninsula. France, Spain, and other powerful kingdoms competed for influence in the region. Eventually, the bronze that had been reserved for the statue was needed for weapons instead. Cannons and military equipment became more urgent than artistic monuments. The great horse was never cast in bronze. The enormous clay model itself was later destroyed during military conflict. For Leonardo, it must have been a painful loss after years of effort and imagination. But his time in Milan was far from wasted. During these years, he deepened his studies of engineering, architecture, and science. His notebooks grew thicker with sketches and observations, and soon he would begin work on a painting that would become one of the most famous artworks in the entire world. A painting that still fascinates people centuries later. a painting that captures a single moment of intense emotion shared among 13 men sitting at a long table. This painting would be known as The Last Supper, and it would change the history of art forever. By the 1490s, Leonardo da Vinci had become one of the most respected figures at the court of Milan. Years of work under the patronage of Ludovico Sforza had allowed him to explore many different talents. He was known not only as a painter, but also as a designer of court festivals, a creator of elaborate stage machinery, an engineer who imagined new military devices, and a thinker whose notebooks were filled with unusual and brilliant ideas. Visitors to the court often heard stories about Leonardo's strange inventions and careful studies of nature. Some described him as an artist. Others saw him as a scientist. Many simply believed he possessed a mind unlike anyone else in Milan. Yet despite all his projects, inventions, and experiments, one commission would define this period of his life more than any other. It came from Ludovico Sforza himself. Inside the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, the Duke wanted a painting that would decorate the dining hall used by the monks. The monastery was a quiet place. Its halls echoed with soft footsteps and distant prayers. The dining room, where the monks gathered each day for their meals, was long and simple, with large walls that seemed almost empty. At one end of the hall, a wide section of wall stood waiting for decoration. Ludovico wanted a painting that would inspire reflection among the monks as they ate their meals in silence. The subject chosen for the mural was a famous moment from the Bible: the final meal shared by Jesus and his disciples before his arrest. The story, known as the Last Supper, had been painted many times before, but Leonardo saw the scene differently. Instead of showing the quiet moment of the meal itself, he focused on a single dramatic instant, the moment when Jesus tells his followers that one of them will betray him. It is a moment filled with shock. The disciples have been sitting together peacefully. Suddenly, Jesus speaks words that change everything. "One of you will betray me." The announcement spreads confusion and emotion through the room. Some disciples look at each other in disbelief. Others question what they have just heard. A few react with anger or fear. Leonardo wanted to capture this sudden explosion of emotion. To do that, he began studying human expressions carefully. He walked through the streets of Milan, observing how people reacted during arguments or surprising news. He watched conversations in markets. He noticed the way people raised their hands when confused or leaned forward when demanding answers. Sometimes he visited taverns, where lively discussions revealed strong emotions. He observed faces constantly. Every gesture mattered. Every movement of the hands, every tilt of the head, every expression around the eyes. Leonardo filled pages of his notebooks with sketches of faces showing curiosity, suspicion, surprise, and anger. He wanted each figure in the painting to feel like a real person, reacting to a real event. When he began painting the large mural on the wall of the monastery dining hall, Leonardo carefully planned the composition. The figures were arranged along one side of a long table. Jesus sits calmly at the center. Around him, the 12 disciples react in different ways to his shocking words. Some lean forward. Some rise slightly from their seats. Others whisper urgently to the people beside them. The entire scene feels filled with movement. Yet despite the dramatic reactions, the composition remains balanced. Leonardo used perspective to guide the viewer's attention toward the center of the painting. Lines in the architecture behind the table all point toward the figure of Jesus. The walls, ceiling, and windows all draw the eye toward him. He becomes the quiet center of the scene, the calm point in the middle of a storm of emotion. Light appears to glow softly around him from the painted windows behind. Around this calm center, the disciples are arranged in small groups. Each group shares its own reaction. Peter leans forward aggressively, as if demanding answers. Thomas raises a finger toward the sky, questioning what he has heard. Matthew turns toward the others beside him, asking for explanation. Judas, the disciple who will betray Jesus, sits slightly in shadow. He clutches a small bag that represents the silver coins he will later receive. Leonardo did not place Judas apart from the others as earlier artists often had. Instead, he sits among them, part of the group. A reminder that betrayal can hide even among close companions. Leonardo wanted every character to feel like a living person caught in a moment of tension. But the process of painting the mural proved difficult. Traditional fresco painting required artists to work quickly on wet plaster before it dried. This method forced painters to complete sections rapidly, leaving little time for experimentation. Leonardo disliked working under such strict limits. He preferred to study and refine details slowly. So he experimented with a different technique. Instead of painting on wet plaster, he applied layers of tempera and oil onto dry plaster. This allowed him to work more carefully. He could return to sections of the painting and adjust details whenever he wished. But the experiment had a serious weakness. The paint did not bond well with the wall. Over time, the surface began to deteriorate. Even during Leonardo's lifetime, parts of the mural started to fade and peel. Despite this technical problem, the impact of the artwork was extraordinary. Visitors who entered the dining hall were astonished. The scene did not feel like a distant religious image. It felt immediate, alive. The disciples appeared to speak, gesture, and react like real people sitting at a real table. Their emotions felt natural and believable. Viewers could almost hear the sudden confusion spreading across the room. Artists from across Italy traveled to Milan to study the painting. They carefully examined the composition, the gestures, and the psychological depth of the figures. Many tried to understand how Leonardo had captured such realistic human emotion. For centuries afterward, the Last Supper would influence countless painters. Even though the original paint slowly deteriorated, the design itself remained powerful. Copies and drawings of the composition spread across Europe. The image became one of the most famous interpretations of a biblical story in the history of art. Meanwhile, Leonardo continued filling his notebooks. His curiosity never rested. While painting religious scenes, he also studied anatomy. He examined human bodies to understand the structure of muscles and bones beneath the skin. He sketched designs for machines that could lift water, grind grain, or help builders move heavy construction materials. He observed clouds, rivers, and swirling water currents. He searched for patterns that explained how nature worked. To Leonardo, everything was connected. Art helped him see beauty. Science helped him understand structure. Engineering allowed him to imagine how ideas might become real machines. But the peaceful years in Milan would not last forever. Across Europe, powerful kingdoms were expanding their influence. Armies marched across borders. Alliances shifted quickly between rulers. Eventually, war would reach Milan. And when it did, Leonardo's life would once again change direction. The brilliant court of Ludovico Sforza would collapse under the pressure of foreign invasion. And Leonardo da Vinci, the artist who had created one of the greatest paintings in history, would be forced to leave the city where he had spent nearly 2 decades. His journey was far from over. In fact, some of his most fascinating discoveries still lay ahead. For many years, Milan had been a place where Leonardo could work freely. The court of Ludovico Sforza supported artists, engineers, musicians, and scholars from across Italy. Within the walls of the ducal palace, creativity was encouraged, and ambitious projects were welcomed. Leonardo thrived in this environment. His days were filled with activity. Some mornings he worked on artistic commissions. Other days he designed stage machinery for elaborate court festivals or sketched ideas for engineering projects that fascinated him. His notebooks grew thicker with observations and inventions. The court of Milan had become a place where his imagination could move without limits. But Europe, in the late 15th century, was unstable. Across the continent, powerful kingdoms were expanding their influence. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire all watched the wealthy Italian city-states with interest. Italy was rich. Its cities controlled trade routes, banking networks, and flourishing artistic cultures. For foreign rulers, these cities were valuable prizes. Political alliances shifted constantly. Wars began and ended quickly. Diplomats traveled between courts trying to maintain fragile peace. In 1499, the situation changed dramatically. French forces invaded northern Italy. Led by King Louis XII, the French army marched toward Milan with determination. Their soldiers were well trained, and their artillery was powerful enough to threaten even strong city defenses. The political balance that had protected Milan for years suddenly collapsed. Ludovico Sforza struggled to defend his rule, but the pressure from the invading forces grew too strong. The once powerful duke was forced to flee the city. In a short time, the brilliant court that had supported Leonardo's work for nearly 2 decades was gone. For Leonardo, the fall of Milan meant uncertainty. Many of the projects he had worked on suddenly lost their purpose. The massive bronze horse he had designed for Ludovico Sforza was never completed. For years, Leonardo had studied horses carefully, creating sketches and models for the enormous monument that was meant to honor the Duke's father. The giant clay model had stood proudly in Milan as a symbol of the project's ambition. But when war reached the city, the clay structure became little more than a curiosity for invading soldiers. According to historical accounts, French troops used the model for target practice. Arrows and weapons struck the sculpture until it was badly damaged. Eventually, the great horse was destroyed. Years of careful work disappeared in a short time. The world Leonardo had known in Milan was gone. Once again, he had to move. Leonardo left the city and began traveling across Italy, searching for new opportunities. For a time, he returned to Florence, the city where he had trained as a young apprentice many years earlier. But Florence had changed since he last lived there. The artistic world had evolved quickly. New painters and sculptors had risen to prominence. Among them were 2 extraordinary figures who would shape the future of art: Michelangelo and Raphael. Michelangelo was younger than Leonardo, but already famous for his powerful sculptures and intense personality. His work displayed dramatic strength and emotional intensity. Raphael was even younger, yet his graceful compositions and balanced designs were quickly gaining admiration throughout Italy. Florence had become a center of artistic rivalry. The presence of such talented artists created an atmosphere of competition. Workshops buzzed with ambition. Each painter wanted to prove their skill and secure prestigious commissions. Leonardo, however, followed his own path. While others focused on large projects and public recognition, Leonardo continued exploring ideas that fascinated him. His curiosity moved easily between art and science. He studied the movement of water, sketching detailed diagrams that showed how rivers curved and currents formed swirling patterns. He imagined systems of canals that could control flooding or improve transportation between cities. He examined the flight of birds, carefully sketching wings and mechanical structures that might allow humans to glide through the air. His notebooks filled with designs for flying machines. Some resembled giant mechanical birds, with large wings that could flap through human power. Others looked more like early gliders, with wide, fixed wings designed to catch air currents and float above the ground. Although these machines were never successfully built during Leonardo's lifetime, they reveal how deeply he studied the principles of flight. He carefully observed birds soaring above hills and rivers. He watched hawks circling high above the countryside. He noted how air currents lifted them effortlessly. He analyzed the angle of their wings and the way their bodies adjusted balance in the sky. For Leonardo, flight was not simply a dream. It was a problem waiting to be solved. Around this time, Leonardo also worked briefly for one of the most feared military leaders in Italy. His name was Cesare Borgia. Borgia was a powerful commander who controlled large areas of central Italy through a combination of military force and political strategy. His campaigns reshaped the political map of the region. Leonardo entered Borgia's service as a military engineer. In this role, he traveled across different territories, inspecting fortifications and designing defensive structures. He studied the walls of cities, examining how they could be strengthened against attack. He created plans for improved defenses and strategic positioning of artillery. During these journeys, Leonardo also produced some of the earliest detailed maps based on careful measurement and observation. His maps were remarkably accurate for the time. They showed towns, rivers, roads, and landscapes with a clear perspective from above. This approach was unusual in an era when most maps were rough, symbolic sketches rather than precise representations of geography. Leonardo treated mapping as a scientific task. He measured distances. He studied the shapes of valleys and hills. He recorded the flow of rivers across the land. Even in military service, Leonardo remained deeply curious about nature and mechanics. As he traveled through the countryside, he examined landscapes carefully. He studied rock formations along cliffs. He observed the movement of water through valleys and streams. Every journey became another opportunity to learn. But eventually Leonardo grew tired of working within the harsh world of politics and warfare. His mind preferred exploration and discovery rather than conflict. So he returned once again to Florence. It was during this period that Leonardo began working on a portrait that would eventually become the most famous painting in the world. The portrait of a woman whose quiet smile would puzzle viewers for centuries. The painting we now know as the Mona Lisa. At the time, it may have seemed like a simple commission, a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. But for Leonardo, the painting became something far more complex. He approached it not simply as a portrait. He treated it as an experiment. an experiment in capturing life itself. Leonardo worked on the painting slowly and patiently. Sometimes he set it aside for weeks or months before returning to it again. He studied how light softened the edges of forms. He blended colors so gradually that transitions between shadow and light almost disappeared. The result was an effect unlike anything most artists had created before. The woman's expression seemed to shift depending on how one looked at her. From one angle, she appeared calm. From another, her smile seemed mysterious, almost playful. The background landscape behind her twisted into distant mountains and winding rivers that faded into soft blue mist. The scene felt dreamlike and timeless. Leonardo never considered the painting truly finished. In fact, he carried it with him for many years, continuing to adjust small details whenever inspiration returned. Perhaps he saw the painting not as a completed portrait, but as an ongoing study of human expression and perception. And while the Mona Lisa slowly took shape, Leonardo's curiosity continued expanding into new areas. He began studying the human body with a level of detail that few artists had ever attempted. He wanted to understand the muscles, bones, and structures hidden beneath the skin. What he discovered during these studies would transform not only art, but also the scientific understanding of anatomy. Leonardo had always believed that to draw the human body accurately, an artist must understand how it truly works. For him, the surface of the body was only the beginning. Muscles move beneath the skin. Bones support weight and determine posture. Tendons stretch and contract to create motion. Every movement of the human body depends on a complex system hidden beneath the surface. Most painters of the time simply copied what they saw with their eyes. They studied the outer appearance of the body, the shape of the face, the position of the arms, the folds of clothing. But Leonardo wanted to go deeper. He believed that true understanding required looking beneath the surface. To paint a figure correctly, he thought, an artist must understand the hidden structures that make movement possible. This belief led him into one of the most unusual areas of study for an artist of the Renaissance: anatomy. During the 15th century, the study of the human body was still limited and often surrounded by social and religious restrictions. Dissections were rare and sometimes controversial. Yet Leonardo was determined to learn. With permission from hospitals and medical institutions, he began examining human bodies after death. These studies allowed him to observe the structure of muscles, bones, organs, and joints directly. Many of these examinations took place late at night. Hospitals were quiet during those hours. Candles provided the only light inside small rooms where Leonardo worked carefully and patiently. Working by candlelight, he dissected bodies and recorded what he saw with extraordinary attention to detail. Every discovery went into his notebooks. He drew bones with remarkable precision. Each curve of the spine, each joint in the fingers, each small bone inside the hand. He sketched muscles layered on top of one another, showing how they connected and moved together. Sometimes he drew the same body part several times from different angles. In one drawing, he showed the outer muscles. In another, he removed that layer to reveal deeper structures beneath. These drawings were not rough sketches. They were incredibly detailed scientific illustrations. Leonardo often approached his drawings almost like a modern medical researcher. He carefully labeled structures. He recorded observations beside each image. He compared different bodies to understand how variations in anatomy might occur. Sometimes he cut away layers of the body step by step in his drawings, almost like modern anatomical diagrams used in medical textbooks today. In one series of studies, he examined the human spine. He analyzed how the vertebrae stacked upon one another to support the body's weight. He noted how the spine allowed flexibility while maintaining stability. In another group of drawings, he carefully mapped the muscles of the arm. He showed how muscles attached to bones through tendons. He explained how these connections allowed the hand to grasp objects, lift weight, or perform delicate movements. Leonardo also studied the mechanics of walking. He observed how balance shifts when a person takes a step. He recorded how muscles coordinate to keep the body stable during movement. He examined how the foot supports weight and adjusts position during motion. These observations helped him paint figures that looked far more natural than those created by most artists of his time. His painted characters stood with convincing balance. Their bodies moved with realistic posture. Their gestures appeared believable. But Leonardo was not satisfied with simply copying anatomy. He wanted to understand the deeper systems that allowed life itself. He began studying how blood moved through the body. He examined the structure of the heart. Most scholars of his time believed the heart functioned in ways described by ancient texts. Leonardo chose to study it directly. He dissected animal hearts and human hearts, examining the chambers and valves that controlled blood flow. In one remarkable study, he described how blood moves through the heart's valves in swirling patterns. This observation would not be confirmed scientifically until centuries later. Leonardo even studied the development of life before birth. In one of his most famous anatomical drawings, he illustrated a fetus inside the womb. The image shows the unborn child curled within the protective space of the uterus. The drawing is both scientifically careful and deeply respectful. It reflects Leonardo's belief that the human body was one of nature's most beautiful creations. To him, studying anatomy was not only a scientific task, it was also an act of admiration for the complexity of life. Yet these studies were not easy. Dissections had to be performed quickly before the bodies began to decay. The rooms where he worked were often cold and dim. The smell of decomposition made the work unpleasant. Many people would have found the experience unbearable. But Leonardo continued. His curiosity was stronger than his discomfort. Night after night he returned to his studies, drawing carefully and recording new discoveries. Over time, his notebooks filled with hundreds of anatomical sketches. Many historians believe that if these studies had been widely published during Leonardo's lifetime, they might have advanced medical knowledge much earlier. His drawings were centuries ahead of their time. They combined artistic precision with scientific observation in ways rarely seen before. Unfortunately, Leonardo rarely organized his findings into formal books. He preferred filling notebooks with ideas rather than preparing finished publications. Most of his discoveries remained hidden inside these private collections of notes and drawings. These notebooks themselves were unusual. Leonardo often wrote his notes using mirror writing. The letters were reversed from right to left, as if written for a mirror to read. Some historians believe he used this technique to keep his ideas private. Others suggest it was simply more comfortable for him as a left-handed writer. Whatever the reason, his notebooks became mysterious documents that few people could easily read during his lifetime. Inside them were not only studies of anatomy, There were sketches of machines, mathematical calculations, observations about water, clouds, geology, and plants. One page might contain detailed drawings of muscles. The next might show designs for a flying machine. Another might explore how water flows around rocks in a river. Leonardo's mind did not separate science, art, and engineering. To him, they were all part of the same great puzzle. Understanding the body helped him paint better figures. Understanding water helped him design machines. Understanding nature helped him imagine technologies that did not yet exist. But despite his extraordinary intelligence and creativity, Leonardo faced a challenge that followed him throughout his life. He began many projects, but finished only a few. His curiosity constantly pulled him toward new ideas. While working on a painting, he might suddenly become fascinated by a scientific question. While designing a machine, he might start studying plants or geology. This restless curiosity made him brilliant. But it also meant that many of his grand ideas remained unfinished. Still, the knowledge he gathered during these years continued shaping his understanding of the world. His notebooks became a growing map of his mind, a collection of discoveries that would one day amaze scholars and scientists centuries later. And soon another powerful ruler would invite Leonardo into a new environment where his talents could be appreciated once again. This time, however, the invitation would come from beyond Italy, from a king who ruled one of the most powerful nations in Europe. By the early years of the 16th century, Leonardo da Vinci was already known across Europe as a man of rare intelligence and creativity. His reputation had traveled far beyond the cities where he had lived and worked. Artists admired his paintings and studied the softness of his shadows. Engineers examined the strange machines he sketched in his notebooks. Scholars were fascinated by the pages filled with observations about anatomy, water, plants, and the motion of the stars. To many people, Leonardo seemed like a man who could understand almost anything. Yet Leonardo himself was growing older. His hair had turned gray, and his long beard had begun to frame his face like that of an ancient philosopher. The years of intense work, travel, and study had slowly begun to weaken his body. But his mind remained as restless as ever. Even in old age, questions continued to fill his thoughts. Italy during this time was still divided and unstable. Powerful armies from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire continued to fight for control of its wealthy cities. The Italian peninsula had become a place of shifting alliances and political tension. Armies crossed borders. Cities changed rulers. Powerful leaders competed for influence. Among the figures involved in these struggles was a young French king named Francis I. Francis had grown up hearing stories about the beauty and creativity of Italy. He admired the paintings, architecture, and learning that had flourished there during the Renaissance. To him, Italy represented a new vision of civilization, one where art, science, and human creativity could transform society. Francis wanted to bring that spirit to France, and he had heard about Leonardo da Vinci. Stories about the Italian master had spread widely across Europe. People spoke about his extraordinary paintings, his imaginative machines, and his endless curiosity about the natural world. The idea of bringing such a brilliant mind to the French court excited the king. Around 1516, Francis I invited Leonardo to come to France and live under royal protection. For Leonardo, the invitation came at a time when Italy had become politically unstable, and many of his previous patrons had disappeared or lost power. He accepted the offer. At nearly 65 years old, Leonardo prepared to leave Italy for what would be the final time. The journey north required crossing the Alps, the towering mountain range that separated Italy from the rest of Europe. The roads were difficult, winding through high passes and narrow valleys. Yet Leonardo traveled slowly, with a small group of assistants and carefully packed belongings. Among the items he carried were several paintings he had kept with him for many years. Some of them he had never truly finished. One of these paintings was the portrait of a mysterious woman with a gentle smile. The painting we now know as the Mona Lisa. Leonardo had worked on it for years, adjusting details and studying the subtle expression of the subject's face. Rather than delivering the painting to the person who had likely commissioned it, Leonardo kept it with him as a personal work. When he crossed the mountains into France, the Mona Lisa traveled with him. Leonardo arrived in France as an honored guest. King Francis I welcomed him warmly and granted him a comfortable residence at a small manor house called Clos Lucé. The house stood near the royal chateau of Amboise, in the Loire Valley. The Loire Valley was very different from the busy cities of Italy. Gentle rivers flowed through green countryside. Forests and fields stretched across the landscape. Small villages rested quietly among vineyards and orchards. Clos Lucé itself was a peaceful residence, surrounded by gardens, quiet paths, and flowing streams. For the first time in many years, Leonardo had the freedom to think without constant pressure from commissions or political struggles. Francis I treated him with deep respect. The king often visited Leonardo to discuss art, philosophy, science, and engineering. Francis was fascinated by Leonardo's ideas. According to some historical accounts, the young king admired the elderly master so deeply that he sometimes referred to him affectionately as his father. Whether the story is fully accurate or slightly romanticized, it reflects the strong respect that existed between the two men. Leonardo was given the title first painter, engineer, and architect of the king. The title recognized not only his artistic talent, but also the wide range of his abilities. Although Leonardo produced fewer paintings during this period, he remained active in many other ways. He designed plans for elaborate royal celebrations and festivals. Court festivities often included theatrical performances, decorations, and mechanical displays that impressed visiting nobles and ambassadors. Leonardo's imagination was perfectly suited for such spectacles. He also sketched ideas for architectural projects, including ambitious plans for palaces and gardens. Even in his later years, Leonardo continued refining the notebooks that had followed him throughout his life. These notebooks contained thousands of sketches and observations gathered over decades. But age was slowly limiting what he could physically accomplish. One of Leonardo's hands had become partially paralyzed, likely the result of a stroke. This made painting much more difficult. The hand that had once drawn delicate lines and blended subtle colors no longer moved with the same precision. Still, his mind continued working. He reviewed old drawings and experiments. He organized some of his notes. He discussed ideas with younger assistants who helped him manage his work. One of these assistants, a devoted student named Francesco Melzi, remained especially loyal. Melzi carefully preserved Leonardo's papers and later helped protect many of the notebooks that survived after his death. Leonardo spent long hours walking through the gardens surrounding his home. The quiet countryside of France offered many opportunities for observation. Even in his final years, he watched nature with the same curiosity he had shown as a child. He studied how water moved through streams. He examined plants and flowers with careful attention. He watched birds gliding above the fields, still fascinated by the mystery of flight. Perhaps these moments reminded him of the early days in the Tuscan countryside of Vinci. There, as a young boy, he had first begun observing birds and wondering how their wings carried them through the air. Now, many decades later, the same curiosity remained. Visitors who met Leonardo during these years often described him as thoughtful and calm. His long beard and quiet manner gave him the appearance of a wise philosopher. But behind that calm exterior remained the same brilliant mind that had spent decades exploring the secrets of the natural world. Leonardo understood that his life was entering its final chapter. Time was becoming limited, but he also knew that ideas could travel far beyond a single lifetime. The sketches contained in his notebooks would one day inspire engineers, scientists, and artists who had never even met him. His paintings would continue to fascinate viewers long after the Renaissance had passed. And the quiet smile of the Mona Lisa would keep raising the same question, generation after generation. What exactly is she thinking? As the years passed at Clos Lucé, Leonardo slowly withdrew from public life. He spent more time reflecting on the discoveries and questions that had filled his extraordinary journey. And in those quiet final years, the story of one of history's most remarkable minds was approaching its final chapter. Even in the peaceful surroundings of France, Leonardo's mind continued moving in many directions at once. The quiet countryside of the Loire Valley offered calm and silence, but inside the rooms of Clos Lucé, his thoughts were as active as ever. For most people, old age is a time to slow down. Years of work and travel eventually lead to rest. For Leonardo, however, growing older did not mean the end of curiosity. It was simply another stage of thinking. Inside the rooms of Clos Lucé, his notebooks were everywhere. Pages covered with sketches, notes, diagrams, and observations were spread across tables, desks, and shelves. Some sheets contained careful drawings of the human body. Others showed complex mechanical gears or bridges designed to span wide rivers. Certain pages were filled with studies of plants and leaves. Others showed strange machines that had never existed before. The notebooks looked less like organized books and more like a landscape of ideas. Each page represented a moment of curiosity, captured in ink. Leonardo had always been fascinated by water. Even as a young man in Florence and Milan, he had spent hours watching rivers and streams, observing how water moved across rocks and through narrow channels. Now in France, he continued those observations. He watched the rivers of the Loire Valley as they flowed quietly through the countryside. He studied how currents formed spirals and waves. He noticed how small disturbances in the water could create expanding circles that moved outward across the surface. To Leonardo, the movement of water was not random. It followed patterns. Sometimes he compared the swirling currents of rivers to the movement of hair or smoke drifting through the air. To him, these similarities revealed something important. Nature often repeated the same shapes and motions in different forms. Water, wind, clouds, and even human hair seemed to follow similar rhythms. These patterns suggested that the world was guided by hidden rules, and if a person observed carefully enough, those rules could be discovered. Leonardo filled pages with drawings of whirlpools. He used delicate lines to capture the swirling motion of water turning around itself. He studied how floods could reshape land, carving valleys and carrying soil across great distances. He imagined systems of canals, locks, and barriers that could guide rivers and control their power. Many of these ideas were far ahead of their time. Engineers, centuries later, would rediscover similar principles when building dams and waterways. Leonardo's notebooks contained the early seeds of ideas that would only become practical long after his lifetime. Yet water was not the only subject that fascinated him. Leonardo also returned often to his studies of flight. For decades he had watched birds soaring across the sky. He had sketched wings, feathers, and mechanical structures inspired by their movements. Even now, when his body was too old to attempt physical experiments, the dream of human flight never left his imagination. In his notebooks, he carefully analyzed how birds adjusted their wings to stay balanced in the air. He studied how they used rising air currents to glide effortlessly without flapping. He examined the angles at which wings caught the wind. He sketched devices with large wings that might allow a human body to glide through the sky. Some designs resembled giant mechanical birds. Others looked more like wide gliders with fixed wings. One drawing even resembled something surprisingly modern. It showed a vertical spinning rotor that could lift upward through the air. Today, we might recognize this design as an early concept, similar to a helicopter. Of course, the technology of Leonardo's time was not advanced enough to build such machines successfully. Materials were too heavy. Engines had not yet been invented. But the ideas themselves revealed how deeply he understood the principles of motion and balance. Leonardo believed that one day humans would fly, and history would eventually prove him right. During these final years, Leonardo also spent time reflecting on art. For him, painting had never been only about decoration or beauty. He believed that painting was one of the highest forms of knowledge. A painter, in his view, needed to understand many different subjects: mathematics, light, perspective, anatomy, nature itself. To paint a landscape accurately, a person needed to understand geology and weather. To paint the human body, one had to understand muscles, bones, and movement. To create convincing space in an image, an artist had to study geometry and perspective. Leonardo believed that painting united many forms of knowledge into a single discipline. He once wrote that the eye was the most powerful tool for learning about the world. By observing carefully, a person could discover truths that books alone could never teach. This philosophy guided his entire life. Curiosity first, observation second, understanding through experience. Leonardo also wrote about the importance of imagination. He believed that artists and scientists shared a common ability. Both needed the power to imagine things that did not yet exist. An engineer imagines machines before they are built. An artist imagines images before they appear on canvas. A scientist imagines explanations for mysteries in nature. For Leonardo, these creative processes were closely connected. That is why his notebooks appear so unusual to modern readers. Instead of separating subjects into different books, he allowed ideas to mix freely. A drawing of muscles might appear beside a flying machine. A sketch of a river might sit next to a design for a bridge. Notes about water currents might share a page with studies of human expressions. To Leonardo, these ideas belonged together. They all came from the same source: the desire to understand how the world works. Despite his achievements, Leonardo remained humble about what he knew. Many pages in his notebooks end not with answers, but with questions. Why does the sky appear blue? What causes the moon to shine? Why do clouds form certain shapes? How does the brain create thought? These mysteries remained unsolved during his lifetime. Yet the questions themselves reveal something important. Leonardo did not believe knowledge had limits. He believed there was always more to discover. Even near the end of his life, curiosity continued guiding him forward. And as time moved quietly through the halls of Clos Lucé, the world outside continued changing. New artists were rising, new scientific discoveries were slowly appearing, but the legacy of Leonardo da Vinci was already taking shape. The artist who painted the Mona Lisa, the engineer who imagined machines centuries ahead of their time, the thinker who believed that art and science were part of the same great journey of discovery. Soon his extraordinary life would reach its final moment, but the ideas he left behind would continue traveling through history, inspiring generations who had never seen the Renaissance world where his story began. By the late spring of 1519, Leonardo da Vinci was living quietly in the small manor of Clos Lucé in France. The once restless traveler, who had spent decades moving between Florence, Milan, and Rome, now passed most of his days in peaceful surroundings. For much of his life, he had lived in busy cities filled with noise, politics, and artistic competition. But here, in the Loire Valley, life unfolded at a much slower rhythm. The countryside surrounding Clos Lucé was calm and gentle. Soft hills rolled across the landscape like waves frozen in green earth. Vineyards stretched across the land in neat lines. Small forests of oak and chestnut trees shaded winding paths that led toward quiet villages. Streams moved slowly through the fields, reflecting the sky like long ribbons of silver. In the early morning, mist often settled across the valley before the sun rose high enough to warm the land. Birds crossed the sky above the fields, their wings gliding through quiet air. For Leonardo, it was a fitting place for reflection. He had spent a lifetime observing nature, studying movement, and asking questions about the hidden patterns of the world. Now, in these final years, he could watch the landscape slowly change with the seasons. He was now 67 years old, an advanced age for that period of history. The years of study, travel, and relentless work had taken their toll on his body. His health had become fragile, and one of his hands remained weak after an illness that had likely been a stroke. The hand that once moved effortlessly across paper and canvas now struggled with precise motion. Painting had become difficult, but his mind remained active. Even in these final months, Leonardo continued speaking with visitors about art, science, philosophy, and the mysteries of nature. King Francis I often visited him, eager to listen to the ideas of the man he admired so deeply. The young king respected Leonardo not only as an artist, but as a symbol of the Renaissance spirit. To Francis, Leonardo represented a time when human creativity seemed limitless, a time when artists studied science, engineers explored nature, and curiosity guided discovery. During their conversations, Leonardo shared stories about his experiments and observations. He spoke about the movement of water and the structure of the human body. He explained how light behaves when it touches different surfaces. Sometimes he discussed ideas for machines that could lift heavy objects or move through the air. For Francis, these conversations were fascinating. The king reportedly enjoyed sitting with Leonardo for long discussions, asking questions, and listening as the elderly master explained the world through careful observation and imagination. Leonardo's rooms at Clos Lucé were filled with drawings and notebooks. Tables were covered with sheets of paper filled with sketches, notes, and diagrams collected over decades. Some pages held detailed anatomical studies. Others contained designs for canals, bridges, or machines that could fly. A few held unfinished sketches of paintings he had once planned to complete. These papers represented the life of a mind that had never stopped exploring. Among the possessions Leonardo kept close were several paintings he had carried with him for many years. The Mona Lisa was still with him. The portrait had traveled across Italy and now rested in France, far from the Florentine workshop where it had first begun. Leonardo never truly considered the painting finished. Even after years of work, he sometimes returned to the canvas. With slow and careful movements, he adjusted small details: a shadow along the cheek, a gentle transition between light and darkness, the delicate softness of the mysterious smile. Perhaps he believed that art, like nature itself, was never truly complete. Both were always changing. During this time, Leonardo also worked to organize parts of his notebooks. With the help of his loyal assistant, Francesco Melzi, he attempted to arrange the many papers and sketches he had created throughout his life. The task was enormous. Leonardo had spent decades filling thousands of pages with ideas. Many of the notes were written quickly. Some were written in mirror writing. Others were scattered across loose sheets of paper filled with drawings and observations. His thoughts had always moved faster than any attempt to organize them. Still, Melzi understood the importance of preserving this work. After Leonardo's death, he carefully protected many of the notebooks, ensuring that at least part of the master's intellectual legacy would survive. As the weeks passed in the spring of 1519, Leonardo's strength continued to fade. The body that had carried him across Italy, climbed mountains, and worked through countless nights of study was growing tired. Yet even as his physical strength weakened, his curiosity remained. He still asked questions about nature. He still observed the movement of water and the patterns of plants. He still watched birds flying across the sky. On May 2nd, 1519, the great thinker, who had spent his life observing the world, quietly passed away. His death marked the end of one of the most remarkable lives in the history of human creativity. Historical accounts say that King Francis I may have been present near Leonardo's side during his final moments, though historians are not completely certain whether this story is entirely accurate. Whether or not the king was there, what matters more is the respect and admiration Leonardo had earned. He was buried in France, far from the Tuscan village where he had first begun asking questions about nature as a child. Yet his journey did not truly end with his death. The notebooks he left behind contained ideas that would continue influencing the world long after the Renaissance. Engineers studying his sketches would recognize early concepts similar to helicopters, parachutes, and armored vehicles. Scientists examining his anatomical drawings would admire the precision of his observations. Artists would continue studying the techniques he developed, the soft blending of shadows, the natural expressions of human faces, the careful balance of composition. The quiet smile of the Mona Lisa would travel through history, becoming one of the most recognized images on Earth. Visitors would stand before the painting centuries later, still wondering about the thoughts hidden behind that mysterious expression. But perhaps Leonardo's greatest legacy was not any single painting or invention. It was his way of thinking. He showed that curiosity could lead a person far beyond the boundaries of any single field. Art could lead to science. Science could inspire invention. Observation could reveal patterns hidden throughout nature. Leonardo da Vinci lived during a time when the world was just beginning to rediscover the power of human creativity. And through his relentless curiosity, he helped demonstrate what the human mind could achieve when it refused to stop asking questions. Yet even after his death, the full extent of Leonardo's brilliance would remain hidden for centuries. His notebooks would scatter across Europe. Many of his ideas would not be understood until long after the technologies needed to build them finally existed. And slowly, generation after generation would rediscover the mind of a man who had been far ahead of his time. When Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519, the world did not yet realize how many ideas he had left behind. To the people who knew him, Leonardo was already famous as a remarkable artist. His paintings had impressed rulers and scholars. His reputation as a brilliant thinker had spread through Italy and beyond. But even those who admired him could not fully understand the depth of his curiosity. Much of Leonardo's greatest thinking had never been shared publicly. It remained hidden inside thousands of pages of notes and sketches. These notebooks were unlike anything scholars had seen before. They were not written like ordinary books with clear chapters or organized explanations. Instead, they were filled with quick thoughts, unfinished studies, and diagrams that sometimes appeared mysterious even to trained readers. Leonardo wrote whenever an idea appeared. Sometimes he filled an entire page with detailed drawings. Other times he wrote only a few lines beside a sketch. A single sheet of paper might contain several completely different subjects. One page might show the muscles of a human arm drawn with careful precision. Another might display gears turning inside a mechanical device designed to move heavy objects. The next might explore how light reflects on water, or how shadows form around curved surfaces. The notebooks looked less like finished books, and more like windows into a constantly moving mind. Leonardo wrote many of his notes using mirror writing, with the words reversed from right to left. When viewed normally, the writing appeared backward. To read the text easily, a person had to place a mirror beside the page. Historians still debate why Leonardo used this unusual method. Some believe he wanted to protect his ideas from being copied or misunderstood. Others think it may simply have been more comfortable for him as a left-handed writer, allowing his hand to move smoothly across the page without smudging the ink. Whatever the reason, the mirror writing made his notebooks even more puzzling to later readers. After Leonardo's death, his loyal assistant, Francesco Melzi, inherited many of these papers. Melzi had worked beside Leonardo for years and understood the importance of the master's writings. He tried to preserve them carefully. For many years, the notebooks remained protected within Melzi's possession. But time slowly changed the fate of the collection. As generations passed, the papers began to scatter. Some manuscripts were sold, others were given away, a few disappeared entirely. Certain notebooks ended up in private collections belonging to wealthy families. Others eventually reached libraries and museums across Europe. Because of this scattering, Leonardo's ideas became divided into many separate pieces. For centuries, many of his scientific observations remained largely unknown. Artists continued studying his paintings. The Mona Lisa and The Last Supper attracted admiration across Europe, but few people realized how advanced Leonardo's scientific thinking had been. Only much later, when scholars began carefully examining the surviving notebooks, did the full scope of his ideas become clear. Inside these pages were designs that looked astonishingly modern. There were sketches of a flying machine shaped like a spiral rotor, an early concept resembling a helicopter. There were drawings of armored vehicles with protective shells and rotating weapons. There were designs for diving equipment that could allow a person to breathe underwater. There were even sketches of parachutes drawn centuries before such devices would be successfully tested. Leonardo had imagined technologies that would not appear in reality until hundreds of years later. Yet many of these designs were incomplete. Leonardo's mind constantly moved toward new questions. Often he left earlier ideas unfinished as new curiosities appeared. This habit sometimes frustrated historians who tried to understand exactly what he intended. But it also revealed something important about how Leonardo thought. He was not only interested in building machines, he was interested in understanding the deeper principles behind them. How does motion work? How do forces interact with one another? How do patterns in nature repeat themselves across different forms? Leonardo believed that nature followed mathematical rules that could be discovered through careful observation. His notebooks contain many examples of this thinking. In one section, he studied how water flows around obstacles in rivers and streams. He drew detailed diagrams showing currents splitting, swirling, and reconnecting. In another set of notes, he analyzed how light behaves when it travels through the atmosphere. He tried to understand why distant mountains appear blue and how shadows soften as they move farther from their source. Leonardo also examined fossils discovered in mountains. At a time when many people believed fossils formed naturally within the earth, Leonardo reached a different conclusion. He realized that many of these fossils were the remains of ancient sea creatures. This led him to believe that areas now high above sea level had once been underwater. Such ideas challenged common beliefs of his time. Again and again, Leonardo returned to the same method. Look carefully, ask questions, record observations, test ideas. This approach closely resembles what we now call the scientific method. Yet during Leonardo's lifetime, science had not yet developed into the structured discipline we know today. Most knowledge still came from ancient authorities or religious tradition. Leonardo trusted something different: direct experience. He believed that nature itself was the ultimate teacher. If a person observed the world carefully enough, the answers would gradually reveal themselves. This belief guided everything he did. It shaped his art. It shaped his inventions. And it shaped the notebooks that would eventually travel across centuries. Today, the surviving notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci are studied in museums and libraries around the world. Scholars continue examining their pages, searching for insights hidden among the drawings and notes. Some pages reveal artistic techniques. Others reveal scientific observations far ahead of their time. Together they form a portrait of one of the most curious minds in human history, a mind that refused to limit itself to a single subject, a mind that believed knowledge had no boundaries. And through these pages, Leonardo da Vinci continues speaking to the future. long after the Renaissance world where he lived has faded into history. Among all the works connected to Leonardo da Vinci, one image has captured human imagination more than any other. A quiet portrait of a woman seated before a distant landscape. Her hands rest gently one over the other. Her posture is calm. Her expression is subtle. And her smile has puzzled viewers for more than 500 years. Today, the painting is known as the Mona Lisa. It hangs inside the Louvre Museum in Paris, protected by glass and watched by thousands of visitors every day. Yet despite its fame, the painting itself is surprisingly small, and the mystery surrounding it has never completely disappeared. Most historians believe the woman in the portrait was Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The painting was likely commissioned as a portrait celebrating a new home or the birth of a child. But Leonardo treated the portrait very differently from typical paintings of the time. Instead of presenting the woman stiffly or formally, he created an atmosphere that feels alive and natural. The landscape behind her is dreamlike. Soft mountains rise in the distance. Rivers wind through valleys that fade into misty blue air. The world behind her seems vast and ancient, almost like a memory of nature itself. Leonardo used his famous technique of soft shading, known as sfumato, to blur the edges of forms. There are no harsh outlines. Light and shadow blend smoothly together. Because of this, the woman's expression seems to change depending on how one looks at her. Sometimes she appears calm. Sometimes her smile feels playful. Sometimes it almost disappears entirely. Scientists and psychologists have studied this effect carefully. Part of the illusion comes from how the human eye processes details. When viewers focus directly on the mouth, the smile appears subtle. But when they look at her eyes, or the surrounding areas, shadows near the mouth create the impression of a stronger smile. Leonardo may have understood this visual effect intuitively. He carefully placed shadows around the cheeks and lips to create an expression that feels alive and shifting. Another unusual feature of the Mona Lisa is the way the subject faces the viewer. Earlier portraits often showed people turned sideways in profile. Leonardo positioned Lisa facing forward, creating a stronger sense of connection between the painting and the viewer. Her eyes seem to follow anyone who moves across the room. This effect adds to the feeling that she is present rather than frozen in time. Yet perhaps the most fascinating detail about the Mona Lisa is that Leonardo never delivered the painting to the family who may have commissioned it. Instead, he kept it with him for years. He carried it from Florence to Milan, and eventually all the way to France. This suggests that Leonardo considered the painting more than just a simple portrait. It may have been a personal study, an experiment in capturing the complexity of human expression, a challenge to see how closely art could imitate life. Over time, the Mona Lisa became more famous than Leonardo himself. Artists studied it carefully. Writers and historians discussed the mysterious smile. In 1911, the painting gained worldwide attention when it was stolen from the Louvre by a museum employee who believed it belonged in Italy. The disappearance shocked the art world. For 2 years, the painting was missing. Newspapers around the world printed stories about the theft. Many people came to the museum simply to see the empty space where the painting had once hung. Eventually, the thief tried to sell the painting to an Italian art dealer. He was caught, and the Mona Lisa was returned safely to the Louvre. the dramatic story only increased the painting's fame. Today, it is one of the most recognized artworks in human history. Millions of people travel from across the world just to stand for a few moments before the small portrait. Some viewers are surprised by its size. Others are fascinated by the mysterious smile that seems to change each time they look. But perhaps the true magic of the Mona Lisa lies in something deeper. It represents Leonardo's belief that art should not simply copy appearances. Art should capture life itself, the subtle emotions of a human face, the quiet beauty of nature, the delicate balance between mystery and understanding. Through this single portrait, Leonardo showed that a painting could become something timeless, a conversation between artist and viewer that continues across centuries. And even today, more than 500 years later, people still stand before the Mona Lisa wondering the same thing. What secret might be hidden behind that quiet smile? Leonardo da Vinci is often remembered as a painter. Yet when historians study his life more closely, they discover that painting was only one part of a much larger story. Leonardo represents something deeper, a type of mind that the Renaissance celebrated. A mind that refuses to stay inside a single discipline. During the Middle Ages, knowledge had often been divided into strict categories. Artists painted, craftsmen built tools, scholars studied philosophy and religion. But during the Renaissance, a new idea began to spread. Human potential was not limited to one skill. A person could study art, science, engineering, mathematics, music, and philosophy all at once. Leonardo embodied this idea more completely than almost anyone else. He could design machines. He could paint delicate portraits. He could analyze how muscles move beneath the skin. He could study how rivers carve valleys across the land. He could imagine machines that might someday allow humans to fly. This wide curiosity earned him a special reputation. People began describing individuals like Leonardo as Renaissance men. The phrase refers to someone whose abilities and interests extend across many different areas of knowledge. But Leonardo's approach to learning was not simply about collecting skills. It was about understanding patterns. He believed the same natural laws appeared everywhere. The branching of trees resembled the branching of veins in the human body. The swirling motion of water looked similar to the movement of air and smoke. The proportions of the human body reflected mathematical harmony found throughout nature. Leonardo studied these patterns carefully. One of his most famous drawings is called the Vitruvian Man. The image shows a human figure standing inside both a circle and a square. The drawing was inspired by the writings of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, who believed that the proportions of the human body followed perfect geometric relationships. Leonardo tested these ideas himself. He measured bodies carefully and calculated how different parts related to one another. The result was a drawing that combined art, geometry, and anatomy into a single, powerful image. The Vitruvian Man became a symbol of Renaissance thinking. It represented the belief that human beings were connected to the structure of the universe itself. Leonardo also believed that observation was more valuable than tradition. Many scholars of his time relied heavily on ancient books for knowledge. Leonardo respected these writings, but he trusted his own eyes more. If a theory from an old text disagreed with what he observed in nature, Leonardo believed nature must be correct. This attitude made him different from many thinkers of his time. It also placed him closer to the modern scientific method. careful observation, testing ideas, recording results. Although Leonardo did not organize his discoveries into formal scientific publications, his approach influenced the way later scientists would study the world. His notebooks show an endless stream of questions. Why do clouds form certain shapes? How do birds remain balanced in the air? Why do some materials reflect light differently from others? Each question led to experiments and drawings. Sometimes Leonardo found answers. Other times the questions remained open, but he never lost the desire to explore. Perhaps this endless curiosity explains why Leonardo rarely finished many of the large projects he began. His attention constantly moved toward new mysteries. When one question was partially answered, another one appeared immediately. Yet this restless mind was also the source of his genius. Leonardo was not satisfied with simple explanations. He wanted to see deeper connections, to understand the hidden structures that link art, science, and nature. That way of thinking helped shape the Renaissance itself, a time when curiosity, creativity, and discovery were celebrated as powerful human strengths. And through his work, Leonardo helped show that imagination and observation together could unlock extraordinary possibilities. Even centuries later, people still look at his drawings and feel the same sense of wonder. How could one person think about so many different ideas? How could one mind explore so many mysteries? The answer may lie in something very simple. Leonardo never stopped asking questions. And in the quiet space between those questions and their answers, the spirit of the Renaissance continued to grow. After Leonardo da Vinci's death in 1519, the Renaissance continued moving forward. New artists painted grand works across Europe. Scientists slowly began building the foundations of modern knowledge. But Leonardo's influence did not disappear. In fact, much of his impact grew stronger with time. During his lifetime, only a small group of people had seen the full range of his ideas. His notebooks remained mostly private, scattered across collections and hidden inside libraries. But as centuries passed, historians, engineers, and artists began rediscovering the pages he had left behind. Inside those notebooks were drawings that seemed almost impossible for the 15th century. There were designs for parachutes shaped like large pyramids of cloth. There were sketches of machines capable of lifting heavy objects using systems of gears and pulleys. There were plans for bridges that could be assembled quickly during military campaigns. There were even diagrams showing early concepts of machines that resembled tanks or armored vehicles. Many of these ideas were far ahead of the technology available during Leonardo's life. Materials were not strong enough. Engines had not yet been invented. Manufacturing tools were too simple to build the complex mechanisms he imagined. Yet the ideas themselves were real. They demonstrated how deeply Leonardo had understood the principles behind motion, balance, and mechanical power. Centuries later, engineers studying his drawings recognized concepts that would eventually appear in modern machines. His sketches of flying devices anticipated ideas used in airplanes and helicopters. His observations about water flow helped influence later studies in fluid dynamics. His anatomical drawings were so accurate that modern medical experts still admire them today. But Leonardo's influence was not limited to science and engineering. Artists across generations continued studying his techniques. The soft blending of shadows, known as sfumato, became a powerful method for creating realistic images. His understanding of perspective helped painters create convincing depth in landscapes and architecture. His focus on emotional expression changed how human figures were portrayed in art. Painters learned that a small movement of the eyes or mouth could reveal complex emotions. Leonardo had shown that art could capture psychology as well as appearance. And then there was the Mona Lisa. Over time, the painting became a symbol of artistic mystery. Writers, historians, and psychologists all attempted to explain the famous smile. Some believed it represented joy. Others thought it suggested quiet confidence or hidden knowledge. Perhaps Leonardo never intended the smile to have a single meaning. Instead, it may have been designed to remain uncertain. A reminder that human expression is never completely simple. Museums around the world now protect Leonardo's surviving works with great care. His paintings are studied by experts. His notebooks are preserved as treasures of human creativity. Visitors stand before his drawings and often feel the same reaction. A sense of wonder. How could one person think so widely? How could someone living more than 500 years ago imagine ideas that would only become possible centuries later? The answer may lie in Leonardo's method. He did not separate imagination from observation. He allowed curiosity to guide him. When he saw something interesting in nature, he followed that curiosity wherever it led. Sometimes it led to art, sometimes to engineering, sometimes to scientific discovery. This freedom of thought allowed Leonardo to explore ideas without limits. In many ways, he became a bridge between two worlds. Behind him stood the traditions of the medieval past. Ahead of him stretched the modern age of science, technology, and exploration. Leonardo did not build the future alone, but he helped open the door. And through that door, generations of thinkers would continue walking. When we look back across the centuries at the life of Leonardo da Vinci, it is tempting to focus only on his greatest achievements. The Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, the incredible drawings of machines and anatomy. But perhaps the most important part of Leonardo's story is something much simpler. Curiosity. From the moment he was a child walking through the fields near the village of Vinci, Leonardo was fascinated by the world around him. He watched birds and wondered how they stayed in the air. He observed water moving across stones and tried to understand its patterns. He studied the human face and searched for the emotions hidden behind expressions. That curiosity never disappeared. As a young apprentice in Florence, it pushed him to study art more deeply than other students. In Milan, it led him to explore engineering, architecture, and mechanical design. Later, it guided him toward scientific studies of anatomy, geology, and natural forces. Even in old age, living quietly in France, Leonardo continued asking questions about nature. For him, the world was an endless source of puzzles waiting to be explored. He once wrote that learning never exhausts the mind. Instead, it feeds the imagination. Leonardo believed that the greatest mistake a person could make was to stop observing, stop questioning, and stop wondering. The human mind, he believed, was capable of extraordinary discovery, but only if curiosity remained alive. Today, more than 500 years after his death, Leonardo da Vinci remains a symbol of that spirit. Students study his drawings, scientists examine his ideas, artists admire the beauty and mystery of his paintings. Yet perhaps the most important lesson he left behind is not contained in any single invention or artwork. It is the way he approached the world. He showed that knowledge does not belong to one field alone. Art can lead to science. Science can inspire invention. Observation can lead to imagination, and imagination can reshape the future. Leonardo did not see boundaries between these things. To him, the universe was a connected system filled with patterns waiting to be discovered. By watching carefully, thinking deeply, and asking questions without fear, he explored that system in ways that few people had ever attempted. Even today, his notebooks still feel alive with ideas. Each page reminds us that discovery often begins with a simple moment of curiosity. A question about how something works, a desire to understand what others have overlooked, a willingness to look longer and think more deeply than those around us. Leonardo da Vinci lived in a time when the modern world was just beginning to emerge. Printing presses were spreading knowledge. Explorers were discovering new lands. Artists and scientists were redefining what human creativity could achieve. And standing among them was a man who refused to accept limits on what the human mind could explore. His life reminds us that genius does not always appear as sudden inspiration. Often it grows quietly through patience, observation, and endless curiosity. So as the night grows quiet and your thoughts begin to slow, imagine Leonardo walking once again through the countryside of Tuscany, a notebook in his hand, watching the movement of clouds above the hills, listening to the sound of water in a distant stream, and asking the same simple question that guided his entire life. What can I learn from this? The answer, as Leonardo discovered, is that the world always has more to teach those who are willing to look closely.